The small town of Willow Creek was quiet that morning, its streets lined with golden leaves scattered by the autumn wind. The sky above was painted in shades of gray, as if nature itself mourned alongside the people gathering at St. Mary's Church. Inside, rows of wooden pews were filled with familiar faces, neighbors, friends, and family members who had come to say goodbye to Margaret Turner, a woman everyone loved dearly. Her warm smile and kind heart had touched countless lives over the years. Emily stood near the front of the church, her hands clasped tightly around an old leather journal she had found just days earlier. She wasn't sure why she brought it today, but something deep inside told her it mattered. At 12 years old, Emily already carried a maturity beyond her age, her sharp blue eyes always watching, always noticing things others missed. Today, they darted around the room, studying each face carefully, the sad ones, the distant ones, and even those trying too hard to look composed. Her father, Mark, sat beside her, his arm resting awkwardly on her shoulder. He kept glancing down at the journal in her hands, his jaw tightening every time he saw it. "You don't need to hold on to that now," he whispered once, reaching out to take it from her. But Emily pulled away slightly, clutching it closer. Something about the way he looked at her made her uneasy, like he knew more than he was letting on. The air inside the church felt heavy, thick with sorrow and unspoken words. A few people stepped up to share stories about Margaret. How she baked cookies for school fundraisers, how she helped neighbors during tough times, how her laughter could light up any room. Each memory drew soft smiles and nods from the crowd, but Emily barely heard them. Instead, she flipped open the journal quietly, scanning one page after another. Words like truth, fear, and danger jumped out at her, scribbled in her grandmother's neat handwriting. What did they mean? Why had Margaret written these things? As the service continued, Emily noticed subtle shifts in the atmosphere. Some guests exchanged nervous glances when certain names were mentioned. Others shifted uncomfortably in their seats, avoiding eye contact altogether. Even her father seemed distracted, fidgeting with his tie or staring blankly ahead. Was it just grief, or was there something else going on? When the pastor invited anyone who wished to speak to come forward, Emily hesitated. Her heart pounded loudly in her chest, echoing through the silence of the church. Everyone expected tears, maybe a sweet story about baking cookies or planting flowers together. But Emily felt something bigger tugging at her, a truth waiting to be uncovered. Slowly, almost reluctantly, she rose to her feet, gripping the journal tightly as she walked toward the podium. For a moment, all eyes were on her, young Emily, standing alone in front of the entire congregation. The weight of their stares pressed down on her shoulders, but she took a deep breath and opened the journal. Her voice trembled as she began reading aloud, sharing fragments of her grandmother's final thoughts. The words hung in the air like storm clouds, casting a shadow over the somber gathering. No one spoke, no one moved, and somewhere in the back of the church, someone let out a shaky sigh. Whatever Emily had uncovered, it was clear this funeral would not end quietly. Days before the funeral, Emily had been upstairs in her grandmother's attic, helping her parents sort through Margaret's belongings. The room smelled faintly of lavender and old wood, a scent that reminded Emily of lazy afternoons spent baking cookies with her grandma. Dust motes floated lazily in the sunlight streaming through the small window as she sifted through boxes of photographs, knickknacks, and forgotten treasures. It was supposed to be a simple task: pack away keepsakes, donate clothes, and toss out anything unnecessary. But something caught Emily's eye almost immediately. Behind a stack of yellowed photo albums, tucked into the corner of the attic, sat a dusty wooden box. Its surface was scratched and worn, like it had been handled often but carefully hidden away. Curiosity tugged at Emily, and she reached for it, brushing off layers of dust with her sleeve. Inside, nestled among faded newspaper clippings and old postcards, lay a leather-bound journal. The cover was cracked with age, but the pages inside were intact, filled with Margaret's familiar handwriting. Emily sat cross-legged on the floor, flipping through the journal slowly. At first, the entries seemed ordinary, notes about daily life, recipes, and little reminders. But as she turned the pages, the tone shifted. Margaret began writing about feeling uneasy, mentioning strange phone calls late at night and people watching her from afar. One passage stood out. "I can't trust anyone anymore. They're getting closer and I don't know who to turn to." Another read. "If anything happens to me, don't believe what they tell you. Look deeper." A chill ran down Emily's spine. Her grandmother had always been strong, practical, and fearless. To see her write such unsettling words felt wrong, like peeking into a world she wasn't meant to know about. She flipped further, finding more cryptic phrases and names she didn't recognize. There were mentions of someone named Dr. Hale and warnings about the pills. Emily frowned, trying to make sense of it all. What pills? And why would her grandmother feel threatened? She decided to ask her father about it later, but when she mentioned the journal over dinner that evening, his reaction startled her. Mark froze mid-bite, his fork hovering awkwardly above his plate. "Where did you find that?" he asked, his voice low and tight. Emily explained about the attic, expecting him to share her curiosity. Instead, he snatched the journal from her hands, flipping through it quickly before snapping it shut. "This is private," he said firmly, avoiding her gaze. "Don't bring it up again." His behavior only deepened Emily's suspicions. Why was he so protective of an old journal? And why did he seem so uncomfortable talking about it? That night, unable to sleep, Emily crept downstairs and retrieved the journal from where her father had hidden it, in a drawer in the kitchen. Sitting under the soft glow of a bedside lamp, she reread the entries, piecing together fragments of what appeared to be a dark secret. Her grandmother had been afraid, not just of illness or aging, but of something far more sinister. By the time morning came, Emily knew she couldn't ignore what she had found. Whatever danger her grandmother had sensed, it hadn't disappeared with her passing. If anything, it lingered, waiting silently in the shadows. As she packed the journal into her bag to take to the funeral, Emily resolved to uncover the truth, even if it meant confronting people she trusted most. After all, Margaret's final words still echoed in her mind. Look deeper. Months passed, and the small town of Willow Creek slowly began to heal. The headlines about Dr. Hale's arrest faded from the newspapers, replaced by stories of local festivals and high school sports victories. Life moved forward, as it always does, but the scars left behind by Margaret's death would take longer to mend. For Emily and her father, the road to recovery was neither quick nor easy, but it was a journey they faced together. Mark made a conscious effort to rebuild trust with his daughter. He spent more time at home, cooking meals, helping her with homework, and even attempting to teach her how to bake cookies, something Margaret used to do effortlessly. Though his efforts often fell short, his chocolate chip cookies were notoriously burnt. Emily appreciated the gesture. She could see the regret in his eyes every time he looked at her, and while forgiveness didn't come easily, she recognized that he was trying. To help process everything she'd been through, Emily started attending therapy sessions recommended by one of the detectives who worked on the case. At first, she was hesitant, unsure if talking to a stranger would make any difference. But over time, she found comfort in sharing her thoughts and feelings without judgment. Her therapist encouraged her to write letters to Margaret, not to send, but as a way to express emotion she struggled to say aloud. Sitting at her desk each evening, pen in hand, became a kind of ritual for Emily. It helped her feel closer to her grandmother, like she still had someone listening. On weekends, Emily visited Margaret's gravesite, bringing fresh flowers and sitting quietly beside the headstone. Sometimes she talked about school or shared funny stories about things her dad did wrong in the kitchen. Other times, she simply sat in silence, letting the peacefulness of the cemetery wash over her. During one such visit, she placed the worn journal gently on the grave, its pages now fragile from constant handling. "This belongs to you," she whispered, tears welling up in her eyes. "Thank you for trusting me." As spring arrived, painting the world in shades of green and gold, Emily noticed subtle changes within herself. The anger that once burned so fiercely had softened into determination. She decided to volunteer at the same community clinic where Margaret had spent countless hours helping others. It wasn't easy stepping into a place connected to so much pain, but Emily felt it was important to honor her grandmother's memory and ensure nothing like this happened again. She started small, organizing supplies and assisting nurses, but soon found joy in making a difference, no matter how minor it seemed. One sunny afternoon, while sorting donated blankets in the clinic's storage room, Emily stumbled upon an old photo pinned to a bulletin board. It was Margaret, smiling brightly alongside other volunteers during a charity event years ago. Seeing her grandmother's face filled Emily with warmth, reminding her of the love and strength Margaret had always embodied. She carefully removed the photo, tucking it into her backpack to take home. That night, she framed it and placed it on her bedside table, next to the last letter she'd written to Margaret. Though the past couldn't be erased, Emily realized she had the power to shape the future. With each passing day, she grew stronger, braver, and more resilient. And though her heart still ached for the grandmother she'd lost, she carried Margaret's legacy with her wherever she went, a reminder that truth, courage, and kindness could overcome even the darkest shadows. As she stood on the porch one evening, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and pink, Emily felt a sense of peace settle over her. The storm had passed, leaving behind clearer skies and brighter horizons. Somewhere, she knew, Margaret was watching and smiling. The church was silent as Emily stood before the podium, her small frame dwarfed by the weight of the moment. Her heart pounded in her chest like a drumbeat, each thud echoing louder than the last. She clutched the leather journal tightly in both hands, its worn edges pressing into her palms. The room felt heavy, every pair of eyes fixed on her, some curious, some confused, others uneasy. For a brief second, she wondered if she should sit back down, let the service continue without disruption. But then she remembered her grandmother's words, "If anything happens to me, don't believe what they tell you." Taking a shaky breath, Emily opened the journal and began to read. Her voice trembled at first, barely above a whisper. "This is from Grandma's journal," she said, holding up the book so everyone could see it. "She wrote this just weeks ago." Clearing her throat, she continued, her tone growing steadier with each word. "I've tried to stay strong, but I can't shake the feeling that something bad is coming. Someone close to me knows more than they're saying. If you're reading this after I'm gone, promise me one thing. Look deeper." A hush fell over the congregation. Even the pastor, who had been standing nearby ready to guide the next speaker, froze mid-step. People exchanged glances, their expressions shifting from surprise to discomfort. Emily scanned the crowd, her gaze landing briefly on her father. Mark sat stiffly in the front row, his face pale, his jaw clenched. He looked like he wanted to stand up and stop her, but instead, he stayed rooted in place, his fingers gripping the edge of the pew. Encouraged by the silence, Emily kept going. She flipped to another page, her voice rising slightly as she read aloud. "They think I don't know about the pills or the calls late at night, but I do, and I'm scared, not for myself, but for those I love." She paused, looking around the room again. Does anyone here know what she meant? Does anyone know why she was scared? The question hung in the air like smoke, thick and suffocating. No one answered. Some people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Others stared straight ahead, avoiding eye contact. In the back of the church, an elderly neighbor dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, though whether it was from sadness or nerves, Emily couldn't tell. Near the entrance, a man in a dark suit leaned against the wall, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. His expression was unreadable, but something about the way he watched her made Emily's stomach twist. When she finally lowered the journal, the silence stretched on for what felt like forever. Then, slowly, murmurs began to ripple through the crowd. A woman whispered to her husband, "What does she mean?" Another muttered, "Poor girl, she doesn't understand." But not everyone seemed sympathetic. Across the aisle, a middle-aged man with sharp features frowned deeply, shaking his head almost imperceptibly. Emily noticed him glance toward her father, their eyes meeting briefly before both looked away. Mark finally broke the tension, standing abruptly and stepping toward the podium. "Emily," he said, his voice strained, "this isn't the time or place for this." He reached out to take the journal from her hands, but she stepped back, clutching it protectively. "Why not?" she demanded, her voice louder now. "If Grandma wanted us to look deeper, why shouldn't we start now?" Her words sent another wave of whispers coursing through the congregation. This wasn't how funerals were supposed to go. Quiet reflections, gentle memories, shared tears. Yet here was Emily, a young girl with fire in her eyes, refusing to let the truth stay buried. As the tension mounted, no one could have guessed how much bigger this moment would become, or how far-reaching its consequences would be. That night, Emily lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling as her mind raced with questions. The confrontation with her father replayed over and over in her head like a broken record. His guilt was written all over his face, but he hadn't said enough to explain why Grandma Margaret had been so afraid, or what she meant about the pills. Emily's heart ached with frustration and sadness. She felt betrayed, not just by her dad, but by the silence that seemed to hang over their entire family. Finally, unable to take it anymore, she slipped out of bed and tiptoed down the hallway toward her father's study. The house was quiet, the kind of stillness that comes late at night when everyone else is asleep. Her bare feet patted softly against the carpet as she moved, careful not to make a sound. She knew her dad kept important things, papers, files, old letters, in his desk drawers. If there were answers hidden anywhere in this house, they'd be there. The study door creaked slightly as she pushed it open, and she froze for a moment, listening intently. No footsteps, no voices, just the faint hum of the refrigerator from somewhere downstairs. Satisfied she was alone, Emily flicked on the small desk lamp, its warm glow illuminating the cluttered workspace. Papers were scattered across the surface, along with pens, receipts, and an empty coffee mug. But it was the locked drawer in the center of the desk that caught her attention. She rummaged through the shelves until she found a paperclip, twisting it into a makeshift lockpick. It took several tense minutes, but eventually, the drawer clicked open. Inside, she discovered a bundle of envelopes tied together with string. Each one was addressed to Margaret in neat handwriting, but what made Emily's stomach churn was the return address. Dr. Richard Hale, Willow Creek Medical Center. Her hands trembled as she untied the string and pulled out the first letter. The words inside sent chills down her spine. Dr. Hale wrote cryptically about staying quiet and keeping up appearances, warning Margaret not to trust certain people. One line stood out sharply. "If you speak to anyone about our arrangement, I can't guarantee your safety." The tone was polite yet menacing, like a snake coiled and ready to strike. Emily flipped through the other letters, each one more alarming than the last. They hinted at some sort of agreement between Dr. Hale and Margaret, though the details remained vague. Whatever it was, it clearly terrified her grandmother, and now Emily understood why. This wasn't just about fear, it was about survival. As she read, tears welled up in her eyes. How could her dad have known about this and done nothing? Why hadn't he protected Grandma? Anger bubbled beneath the surface, mixing with sorrow and confusion. Determined to uncover the full truth, Emily tucked the letters back into the drawer and quietly closed it, making sure everything looked undisturbed before slipping back to her room. Once under the covers, she opened the journal again, flipping to the passages she'd read earlier. Now they made even more sense. The pills Grandma mentioned must have been connected to Dr. Hale. Was he using his medical practice to do something illegal? And if so, how many others might be involved? By morning, Emily had pieced together fragments of a terrifying puzzle. Dr. Hale wasn't just a doctor, he was dangerous. And if Grandma had uncovered his secrets, it explained why she ended up dead. Panic gripped Emily as she realized she might be in danger too. Whoever killed her grandmother wouldn't hesitate to silence anyone else who got too close to the truth, including her. But instead of letting fear paralyze her, Emily resolved to act. She couldn't let Grandma's death be in vain. Clutching the journal tightly, she whispered into the darkness, "I'll finish what you started, Grandma. I promise." The days following the phone call to 911 were a whirlwind of activity. Detectives arrived at the house within hours, their presence both reassuring and intimidating. They combed through every piece of evidence Emily and Mark provided: the journal, the letters from Dr. Hale, and even old voicemails Margaret had saved on her phone. Each new discovery seemed to confirm what Emily had suspected all along. Her grandmother's death wasn't natural. It was murder. Investigators worked quickly, piecing together the puzzle that Emily had started unraveling. They traced Dr. Hale's connections, uncovering a web of illegal activities tied to his medical practice. Prescription drugs meant for patients were being diverted to the black market, sold at exorbitant prices to desperate buyers. Margaret had stumbled upon this operation while volunteering at the clinic where Dr. Hale worked. When she confronted him, he silenced her with threats, and eventually, something far more permanent. A week later, authorities announced a breakthrough. Toxicology reports revealed traces of a lethal substance in Margaret's system, confirming foul play. The news sent shockwaves through Willow Creek. Neighbors whispered behind closed doors, struggling to reconcile the image of the kind-hearted doctor they knew with the criminal mastermind investigators described. For Emily, it was validation, proof that her instincts had been right all along. Dr. Hale was arrested shortly after the announcement, taken into custody during a raid on his clinic. Cameras captured the scene as officers led him out in handcuffs, his polished demeanor cracking under the weight of the charges against him. He tried to maintain an air of innocence, insisting he was being framed, but the mountain of evidence said otherwise. Letters addressed to Margaret, financial records linking him to drug trafficking, and testimonies from former employees painted a damning picture. Mark cooperated fully with the investigation, providing crucial details about his conversations with Margaret before her death. In exchange for his testimony, prosecutors agreed not to press charges against him for withholding information earlier. Though relieved to avoid legal consequences, Mark carried the weight of his silence heavily. Every time he looked at Emily, guilt flickered across his face. He spent hours sitting quietly in Margaret's old armchair, staring off into space as if trying to rewrite the past. For Emily, justice felt bittersweet. Knowing Dr. Hale would pay for what he'd done brought some comfort, but it couldn't bring Grandma Margaret back. She often found herself curled up in her grandmother's favorite spot by the window, clutching the worn journal close to her chest. Sometimes she'd read passages aloud, imagining Margaret's voice echoing softly in the room. Other times, she simply sat in silence, letting memories wash over her. The trial began months later, drawing national attention. Reporters camped outside the courthouse, eager to document the downfall of a once-respected physician. Inside, Emily listened intently as witnesses recounted the horrors of Dr. Hale's operation. Former patients spoke of addiction and despair. Colleagues admitted turning a blind eye to suspicious behavior. And then there was Mark, who took the stand with visible nerves but unwavering honesty. His testimony left no doubt about the role Dr. Hale played in Margaret's death. When the verdict came down, guilty on all counts, the courtroom erupted in murmurs. Dr. Hale was sentenced to life in prison without parole, ensuring he could never harm anyone again. As Emily stood alongside her father, watching the judge deliver the final words, she felt a strange mix of emotions. Relief, anger, grief, and hope swirled inside her like storm clouds breaking apart to reveal sunlight. Though the nightmare was finally over, Emily knew healing wouldn't happen overnight. Too much had been lost, too many secrets unearthed. But as she walked out of the courthouse that day, the autumn breeze brushing against her cheeks, she allowed herself a small smile. Justice had been served, not just for her grandmother, but for everyone Dr. Hale had hurt. And somewhere, deep down, Emily believed Margaret was smiling too. After the funeral service ended, the tension that had built inside the church spilled out into the crisp autumn air. Mourners gathered near the parking lot, huddled in small groups as they whispered about what had just happened. Some were sympathetic toward Emily, patting her on the shoulder and offering kind words. Others shot disapproving glances at Mark, who stood off to the side, running a hand through his hair and looking visibly shaken. The atmosphere was charged, like storm clouds gathering before rain. Emily didn't waste any time. As soon as she saw her father step away from the crowd, she marched up to him, the journal still clutched tightly in her hands. "Dad," she said firmly, her voice cutting through the murmurs around them. What did Grandma mean? Why was she scared? Her blue eyes locked onto his, searching for answers he clearly didn't want to give. Mark hesitated, glancing nervously over his shoulder to see if anyone was listening. When he turned back to Emily, his expression softened, but only slightly. "It's complicated, Em," he began, crouching down to meet her eye level. "You wouldn't understand. I'm not a kid anymore." Emily snapped, her voice rising with frustration. "Grandma trusted me enough to write this stuff down. She wanted someone to figure it out. Why won't you tell me the truth?" Her outburst drew stares from nearby relatives, but Emily didn't care. She held up the journal again, flipping it open to one of the more cryptic entries. "Look at this. They think I don't know about the pills. What does that even mean? And who are they?" Each question came faster than the last, relentless and sharp. Mark's face paled further, and for a moment, he looked like he might crumble under the weight of her demands. But then something shifted in his demeanor. He straightened up abruptly, snatching the journal from her grasp. "Enough, Emily," he said sharply, his tone leaving no room for argument. "This isn't your burden to carry." His reaction only fueled Emily's anger. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she blinked them away stubbornly. "Why are you so scared to talk about it?" she demanded, her voice cracking. "Did you know Grandma was in trouble? Did you do something about it?" The accusation hit Mark like a punch to the gut. For a split second, guilt flashed across his face, just long enough for Emily to notice. "That's not fair," he muttered, turning away from her. But Emily wasn't done. She followed him, refusing to let him retreat into silence. "You're hiding something," she insisted, her voice growing louder now. "If you knew Grandma was scared, why didn't you help her? Why didn't you stop whatever was happening?" By now, several people had stopped talking and were watching the scene unfold. One of Emily's aunts stepped forward, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Sweetheart, maybe you should calm down," she suggested softly. But Emily shrugged her off, her focus entirely on her father. Mark finally spun around, his patience snapping like a brittle twig. "You have no idea what you're talking about," he shouted, his voice carrying across the parking lot. Heads turned, conversations halted, and an uncomfortable silence settled over the group. Even the wind seemed to pause, holding its breath. For a moment, Emily stared at him, stunned by the raw emotion in his voice. Then, slowly, realization dawned on her face. "You did know," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You knew Grandma was in danger, and you didn't do anything." It wasn't a question. It was a statement, heavy with accusation. Mark's shoulders slumped, the fight draining out of him. He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. Instead, he simply stood there, looking defeated, while Emily took a step back, shaking her head in disbelief. Whatever bond they'd shared before felt frayed, stretched thin by secrets and lies. As the crowd dispersed awkwardly, leaving father and daughter alone in their turmoil, Emily realized something important. If her dad wouldn't give her the answers she needed, she'd have to find them herself. And deep down, she already knew where to start. The journal. The next morning, Emily's resolve burned brighter than ever. She couldn't unsee the letters or forget the chilling words written in her grandmother's journal. The pieces of the puzzle were coming together, but she knew she needed help. Someone who could guide her without being part of the tangled web surrounding Dr. Hale and her family. Her first thought was to confront her father again, but after their explosive argument at the funeral, she doubted he'd willingly cooperate. Instead, she decided to show him the evidence she'd uncovered, forcing him to face the truth. After breakfast, when Mark retreated to his study as usual, Emily followed him. She knocked softly on the door before stepping inside, clutching both the journal and the bundle of letters. Her father looked up from his desk, surprise flickering across his face. "What is it now, Emily?" he asked, his tone tired but tinged with irritation. "I found these," she said firmly, placing the items on the desk in front of him. "They're letters from Dr. Hale to Grandma. Read them." Mark hesitated, his eyes darting between Emily and the pile of papers. For a moment, he seemed frozen, unsure whether to ignore her or give in. But something in her determined expression must have struck a chord because he finally reached for the letters. As he read through them, his face grew pale, his hands trembling slightly. By the time he finished, he slumped back in his chair, rubbing his temples as if trying to erase the weight of what he'd just seen. "Emily," he began, his voice heavy with guilt. "I didn't know about these specific letters, but I suspected something wasn't right. Your grandma came to me months ago, scared out of her mind. She told me she thought Dr. Hale was involved in something illegal, something to do with prescription drugs. I promised I'd look into it, but..." His voice trailed off, shame clouding his features. "But what?" Emily pressed, her voice rising despite her attempt to stay calm. "You did nothing. You let her die." "It's not that simple," Mark shot back, his own frustration bubbling to the surface. "I wanted to protect us, to keep you safe. If I had gone to the police back then, who knows what would have happened. Dr. Hale has connections, Emily. Powerful ones. I was afraid of what he might do if we crossed him." Emily stared at her father, anger and disbelief swirling inside her. "So you chose to stay silent while Grandma suffered, while she died alone, thinking no one believed her." The words hit Mark like a punch to the gut. He buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking as tears welled up in his eyes. "I'm sorry," he whispered hoarsely. "I never meant for any of this to happen. I thought I was doing the right thing." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The room felt suffocating, the air thick with regret and unanswered questions. Finally, Emily broke the silence. "We can't fix the past, Dad, but we can make sure Grandma's death wasn't for nothing. We need to tell someone. The police, anyone who can stop Dr. Hale." Mark nodded slowly, wiping his eyes. "You're right," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've been selfish and cowardly. It's time to do what's right, even if it's too late for your grandma." He stood up, determination replacing the fear in his eyes. "Let's call 911. As they sat together in the living room waiting for the authorities to arrive, Emily felt a mix of emotions. Relief that her father was finally taking action, sadness for everything her grandmother had endured, and a lingering unease about what might come next. When the officers arrived, Mark handed over the journal and letters, explaining everything he knew. The investigators listened intently, their expressions growing graver with each detail. By the end of the conversation, Emily could see the wheels turning in their minds. They promised to launch a full investigation into Dr. Hale's activities, assuring her and Mark that justice would be served. Though the road ahead wouldn't be easy, Emily felt a glimmer of hope. For the first time since her grandmother's death, she believed the truth might finally come to light. And that maybe, just maybe, Grandma could rest in peace.